All right, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Listen, for those of you who don't know, my name is Jessica Harris, and I want to just welcome you over to this channel where we talk about all things writing. Listen, I am an author, I'm a podcaster, a mom to three amazing little people, and also an empowerment life coach, a speaker, and just a little bit of everything, right? So I feel like we do all the things and so much more. If you're new to this channel, I just welcome you to go ahead and firstly, just like, share, and subscribe to the channel head over here. Click that bell above as well so you can be notified the next time a video gets dropped. So I did want to say, excuse me for the appearance today. I am not going live in the sense of you being able to see me only because I am literally in the midst of doing my hair. But on the next video, you will be able to catch me live. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. Today's conversation is all about writing doesn't have to be hard. Now, if you have stumbled essentially, right, across this channel, or maybe you have subscribed in the past, the reason 9 times out of 10 is because there's a desire inside of you to begin writing. Whether that's you feel like you're called to write a book, whether that's you feel to called, to start up a podcast or anything of that nature, I just want to inform you offhand, right, that you are not alone in this journey. And please know that writing doesn't have to be hard. Now, you heard me mention the podcast part, especially when it came to writing. And the reason being is this: I have to look at the fact that writing is something that is fundamental in pretty much every arena and every area of our lives. We don't just look at writing as far as like books that we see or plays that people go to, but writing truly is embedded in everything, right? You have to read the instruction manual in order to build things or to use things. You have to be able to read when it comes to, all sorts of stuff that happens in day-to-day life. But that being said, you're also writing, right? You're writing out contracts, you're writing out your signature, you're building your brands, you're writing out scripts, you're creating outlines, especially if you're somebody who's already in the media industry. Maybe you're someone who creates a lot of reels, right? Maybe you're someone who has your own channel already and it's blooming, or maybe you're somebody who's just starting out and you're like, listen, I want to start out, but I don't know where to begin. Well, I want to let you know, like I mentioned in the title, writing doesn't have to be hard. Now, there's two ways that we're going to talk about this. The first way that I'm going to say that writing doesn't have to be hard is coming from the perspective of somebody who's sharing their story. Now, I'm using this particular area because this for me is exactly where I started. I didn't start anything in media out of thin air. Everything that I did, everything that I started in, literally came from me talking about myself, talking about my story, talking about my personal journey, right? Of transformation, of learning to love myself, of learning to embrace who God is calling me to be, of learning to heal through trauma when my son almost passed away due to a rare medical situation. So there's so many elements there that took place in my life, but it all came from writing. Writing was the source. Well, I'll rephrase that. Writing was the tool, there we go, right? That God placed in my lap to be able to say, hey, if you would just write what it is that you're going through, you'll see what's happening with you. So I wanted to encourage you guys today to get up, grab your pen, grab your paper, right? Grab your journal. And if you don't already have a journal, I want to invite you to go ahead and visit our website at www.igniteyourglow.com. Why? Because we sell journals there. We sell journals. One is called the Believe Again Journal. One is called the Dear God Journal. I have another one that should be coming out. I want to say it should be launching next month, just because there were some edits that I had to make with it. But yes, there are different journals. My daughter even has a journal that she calls the BU Journal. So, yes, definitely grab yourself a journal. I'm going to say that part for starters. But not only do I want you to grab yourself a journal, I want you to get into the habit of journaling. When I think about when it came to me and my own personal process and journey of really just beginning to write books and beginning to write scripts and stuff like that. It didn't happen overnight. And that's just being like completely honest. And I talk about this a lot too on my podcast, Ignite Your Glow. And I tell people all the time, like, listen, when I got into this journey of like being called into media, it wasn't like a, hey, I'll do it and no problems. There was a lot of like tug and war from me just because I didn't feel like when I was worthy to do it. I didn't feel like anybody really wanted to listen to my story. I didn't feel like I had enough to be said. And that's just being like completely honest there. But I want you to know on this day that that's not true. That the story that's inside of you, especially your personal experiences, there is someone who needs to hear it, right? There is someone that is connected to your voice. There is someone who is waiting on you to show up as you so they can reach their breakthrough. And I feel like the one of the biggest things or the biggest hurdles that we sometimes face, whether it's in writing or whether it's in our career or building a brand or a business or even just in life in general, right, is the fact that we have to literally come against ourselves. There's a version of us that doesn't see what it is that we're created to do, right? There's a version, and this may not be everybody, but I know this was true for me, right? There was a version of myself that I was living as that didn't see the potential of what writing could do, of what the doors could look like if I would just sit down and write. There was a version of myself that didn't understand that the very thing that I was fighting against was the very arena that was going to open up opportunities for me. And I feel like that's the part that we have to learn how to move out of our own ways. Now, moving out of the way is going to look different for different people, right? Sometimes you moving out of your own way is you looking in the mirror and having to affirm yourself daily and getting yourself to see that you are more than a conqueror and that you are worthy. Sometimes getting over yourself or getting past like that obstacle of self doubt is getting into the word of God. And I'm using that because that was my experience. I had to sit before the throne of grace. I had to sit before God. And I'll go backwards a little bit to kind of explain why. Because I don't want you thinking that, oh, one day I woke up and I just, went into prayer and that was it. No, 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 no. That is not the way that it happened for me. In all actuality, I've always had a desire to write, especially when I was younger, when I was in high school, when I was in college. It was there a little bit, but it wasn't really as big. Let's just say I was the person who was running from writing even when I was in college. And I didn't have a reason as to why. I don't know, I just didn't want to do it, right? It was an area that I had to get over myself. Anyways, I remember having a professor of mine kind of like stop me, like, hey, your grade right now is suffering because you didn't do your research paper. And I didn't have a reason to not do a research paper. I legit just didn't want to do it. Thank you, God, for the reminder. Okay, so the reason as to why I didn't want to do the research paper was because I thought it was too hard. I thought it was too hard of a task to do. In high school, I basically would like try to avoid doing research papers, or I would like do the bare minimum, which is crazy because I went to a college prep school. So obviously, like the standards were pretty high when it came to like what we submitted, but I was like not submitting my best work. And there was this fear when it came to like writing research papers. And I can't tell you why there was this fear, but there was. I just didn't feel like I could do it. I didn't feel like if I did it, that it would be like something that anyone would want to read. So it was kind of like, why waste my time on something if it's not going to be good enough, right? And that was kind of the mentality that I brought with me when I went to college. And I remember having my professor really just sit down with me and just really trying to understand, like, yo, if you do this paper, right, you're gonna pass with no issues. And I remember just being like, okay, fine. Like, let me just get it over with. And at the time, I was pregnant with my first child. I had moved from one state to another state. So it was a lot of transitions taking place in my life at that time. And I remember just being like, you know what? Let me just write this paper. Like, let me just write this paper. Let me just see what happens. And yes, y'all, the way that I'm talking is probably the very attitude that I had about it. Because for whatever reason, I just didn't see how I would be able to do it. I just didn't see myself as being worthy. And it's so crazy to say that, right? Like the confidence wasn't there. But that's what it was. And me graduating college, y'all, I graduated college back in 2018. So this wasn't that long ago when I had started college. Like this was fairly recent within the last 10 years. So, anyways, I remember finally doing my research paper, and you would not believe it. Y'all, I passed. I passed, and not only did I pass, but when I wrote the paper, I realized how easy it was to write a research paper. And I couldn't believe it. I literally sat there when I was done after I had submitted it to her, and I was just looking at the work like, yo, all this time you mean to tell me? Oh, that's what it was. It was the bibliography part of the research paper, making sure that I could quote right and things of that nature. And the bibliography would kind of like catch me up a little bit. So I just never wanted to do it because I didn't want to be like plagiarizing stuff. There we go. Thank you for the reminder, God. Yeah, that was like another hurdle for me. Anyways, I remember finally submitting it. And when I tell you the amount of joy that I felt at that moment was like crazy because I was just so filled with joy, so overwhelmed with emotions because I couldn't believe that I had did the very thing that I had been dodging for like basically all of my life when it came to school. And I'm sharing that story with you because I knew that I could write in a sense of like, yeah, give me a paper to write and I'll write it, right? If it's a matter of something that's of my opinion. But when it came to doing research on it, it wasn't that the research component was difficult, but it was me not being confident in the fact that I could put it together well. And it's so crazy because after that experience, y'all, I did amazing when it came to other research papers and projects. So much so that even in my current job, I'm tasked with doing projects such as that. And it's just wild to me to think like there was a point in my life where I was running from an area that I actually was good at. And I'm sharing that part because it was hard to me because of a limiting belief that I had about myself. That limiting belief wasn't fact, right? That limiting belief was fiction. It wasn't true. The idea in my mind that I wasn't able to do it was a figment of my imagination, right? It was a figment of what I saw in myself. It was a version of me that I wasn't called to be. But because I saw myself from that limited perspective, from that limited viewpoint, I wasn't able to truly embrace, right, who I was called to be in the sense of being able to write out these papers, these pages, and things of that nature with ease. And because of that self limiting belief, it caused, I want to say, like a delay in the sense of I could have been doing more from jump, right? Maybe my interests would have been a little bit different. Maybe my majors in school would have been different, right? And not to say I didn't do well in school. Well, for high school, that's a different story. But in college, like I made Dean's List a few times actually. So I did pretty well in college, even with having two kids like in the midst of that journey. But I'm stating that part to say, like, I could have been in a different place had I not doubted who I was called to be, had I not doubted what was placed on the inside of me. And I know that God has a timing for everything, but I have to wonder, right? What life would be like if we didn't doubt the person that we're called to be. If we had already started walking out life as the person that God already intended us to be. Because the truth is this, when we look at Jeremiah 1:5, right? We understand that the word is telling us that God already knew us before we was ever formed in a mother's womb. So if he already knew who I was, who you were, that means he already knows the purpose that he placed inside of us. He already knows the calling that is on our lives, right? He already knows who we're becoming, right? Because essentially we live life trying to seek out a purpose that, from my perspective, already exists. We're seeking something outwardly from other people when in reality, God is like, it's already in you. Now, that doesn't mean that you may not have to go to school. You may have to go to school, right? To learn the tools, to get the education, to meet the connections, etc., etc. But then there are people who simply are able to just walk out in certain things and they don't have to do all of that. Why? Because there's a designed purpose for their life that calls them to do things in the manner in which they are doing it in. And then there's this part that we like to call choice, right? Because, like I said, in high school, I chose not to actively do these papers. So, if I had taken the chance on myself and chose to do them, I would have gotten a different result a lot sooner. And I'm sharing that part because I made it harder than what it needed to be. Not because it wasn't necessarily hard, but because of the perspective, because of the lens that I saw it through, because of the way that I viewed myself and my own capabilities that caused me not to be able to embrace it in full. And I want to really highlight all of that to you because when I say the title, right, like the title comes to mind of writing doesn't have to be hard, I have to look at, well, what was getting in the way? And it was literally a me versus me situation, right? Me versus me. I had to get out of my own way. And how often, right, do we, not only like as believers, but just as human beings, right? How often do we get in our own way? How often do we look at something and we immediately say, this is too hard, this is too difficult, without actually giving it a fair shake, without actually giving it a fair try, right? Without actually bothering to see if whether or not it can actually, be accomplished, be done. How often, right? Have you looked at a situation? I know I have. I've looked at things and I'm like, I didn't even like ask questions. I just looked and was like, yeah, that's too hard to do. I'm all set. No, thank you. Right. And then you keep pushing and you go in the other direction. Right. And you don't give it a chance to see, like, hey, can I actually go ahead and do this? Right. Can I build this? Is this something that I might be able to do? And I feel like that's the part where patience and endurance that gets built up inside of us over time is important because as we are patiently waiting for things to come and as we are patiently waiting for pieces to come together, we are then able, right, to build up an endurance. And that endurance, I feel like, also gives us a level of strength, right? Because when we're enduring, we're able to really kind of like move in it differently. And then now we're like, oh, I get it. Like, I just needed to do X, Y, and Z. But there was something in our character that had to be built in order to receive it. Because otherwise, we would have rejected it, just like we did the first time, just like I did for all those years, right? I rejected what was in front of me, but not realizing I didn't need to reject it if I could just see myself from a different angle and a different perspective. So, writing doesn't have to be hard. Let's get back to the topic here. Writing doesn't have to be hard depending on the ways in which you look at it. I know that there's people who I talk to and I'm like, hey, you dream, or hey, you have ideas, they're really great. Maybe you should write those down, right? So this way you can, have them in a journal, bring it to pray with God later, like writing them down. And there's so many people who I talk to who are kind of like, no, I'm okay, or no thank you, right? Because they don't want to write. They're like, my handwriting's not that good. Like I start getting hit with the excuses of my handwriting's not that good, I don't have a journal, I don't really like writing, it hurts my hands. Like, y'all, I get thrown so many excuses from so many different people when it comes to the writing part. And that's just doing like the simple stuff. I'm not even asking them, to write a book. So these are like people that I like know like in real life. And it's so crazy to me because I'm like, huh? Like, that's just an excuse, right? Like, y'all better start writing down your dreams and your visions and your ideas and the stuff that comes to mind. Like, write that down. That stuff is gold. But they're just constantly like, no, 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 right? And all these excuses just kind of begin to just come to the surface. And the more the excuses come to the surface, the more that they begin to believe in that excuse, right? So if you're stating out loud, it's too difficult and it's too hard, you're now speaking something that is activating that belief inside of you, right? If we can believe that God tells us in the word, call things forth that are not here as though they are, right? Like, literally, that's what he tells us. Even in, I'm going to look it up because it's coming to mind because I said that part, but it's in John 1 that says, in the beginning, the word already existed. The word was with God, and the word was God. Listen, when we understand the power that our words have and what we say, we understand that it has an effect on us when it comes to what we see on the outside, right? It has an effect on us when it comes in the ways in which we behave and how our mindset is out and how our mindset perceives things, right, on the outside. When we begin to understand that, hey, all of that thought process that you just went through to tell yourself why you can't has now been embedding itself. It's now planting seeds within you to believe that. And the more you speak like that, the more you're literally nourishing that thing. And those aren't the type of seeds you want to be cultivating, right? We don't want to be cultivating a grounds of unbelief or grounds of doubt or grounds of lack of faith. We don't want to be cultivating an area or space within ourselves or our minds that says that we can't do it, especially when we serve a God who has bigger purpose for each and every one of us, especially when we serve a God that has already gone before us, right? Because remember, if we say that the Lord already knows who we are before we are called, right, in this world, in this lifetime, and we're not believing in it, it's a little difficult for us to walk out into it. But when we can believe what it is that He has spoken about us, then we can begin to walk out on that journey. So, in other words, if God is saying, hey, I'm giving you all these ideas to write down because I'm going to need you to act on them without you writing them down, without you speaking life to them, it can cause delay. And not only delay for you, but delay in the blessings that God has for you, delay in the people that are attached to you. Because remember, nothing that we do is for ourselves. Everything that we do is to give God glory and it's to shine His light on us, right? Because we're children of the light. When we do things for the Lord, it blesses Him, it blesses us, but it also blesses those that He puts in our pathway because we're connected to other people. Our bloodline, those that are around us, friends, strangers, y'all, you name it, it's attached. There's so many elements that are attached to us. So when we don't do what we're called to do, it causes a delay in something else. And then God is a God who says, well, my word will come to pass. My word shall come forth. And then there's times where He will raise up another person to carry that mantle. Why? Because He knows that seed must come because that's His word. He's not a man that shall lie. So I'm encouraging you there to understand the responsibility or the weight of doing the simple things, of simply just writing, right? Now, let's get into the nittier stuff, right? The nitty gritty of it. When I think about writing and I think about the big project that is at hand for writing, for example, writing a book, because like, listen, a book's been coming to mind for me for the last 20 years. At some point, you have to begin to say to yourself, because I've met people like that, where they'll say in conversation that they've been in the process of writing a book for the last 10 years, for the last 20 years, for the last 5 years, they've been writing a book, or they know that there's been this nudging for them to write a book. right? And it's been 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, and they're sitting on this idea and they haven't done it for whatever reason, right? Whether it's because they felt like it was too hard, they felt like it was too big of a project, they didn't believe in themselves or their abilities, they didn't have anybody speaking life and pouring into them, they didn't have anyone who could see past where they were to help them get through it. They were still walking in the trauma. They were still walking in the shame. They were still being triggered, right? They were still, going through the motions and whatnot. Like there's so many elements that ties into why a person may not do what they're called to do, especially in this case when it comes to writing. Now, you would think, right, that writing is simple, like, oh, yeah, just grab a pen and just start writing. And on the hypothetical side, it is, right? It is that simple. But from my experience, when it was no longer just a, hey, let me write just to write, and when it came down to, hey, I could feel it in the spirit, like God is asking me to write, like, write a book. I'm looking like, God, write a book about what? Or write a book about this. Like, God, I ain't trying to write about that. Like, God, we still going through it, yada yada. Like, I could see myself at that time in my life beginning to develop all the excuses. So when I hear people who I come into interactions with and they have those same excuses, right? And I can understand why. I'm able to relate to them as to why they feel that way. Because there was a point in my life where I felt the same way. There was a point in my life where I was going through something really similar and I understood the pushback that you give. And it's so crazy to think that the simple things that we're asked to do by God is where the greatest pushback begins to happen, because all of a sudden our thoughts begin to be hammered down with every negative self-talk and every negative belief that we could think regarding ourselves, that we forget who the God is that we serve, and we begin feeding in to that negative talk. And I believe for me, like that's why I feel like it's so important to like guard our hearts, guard our minds, guard our thoughts, right? Because it's easy for the enemy to see like a hole or a breach in a sense, right? In our faith. It's easy for him to be like, and that's where I'm gonna get her, right? Or that's where I'm gonna get him. Because all of a sudden, we now left an opening, right? That unbelief left an opening, that unforgiveness left an opening, and that opening has now allowed something to come in that we didn't expect or that we weren't prepared for. And then we start feeding into it, because instead of us rebuking the thought or rebuking the idea, instead of us saying like, God, I cast that to the pits of hell, like that's not what you said, and then we have to start quoting scripture back to ourselves. Instead of doing that, we allow ourselves to kind of fall into this pit, right? And it's not a pit that was ever created for us to fall into, but it was a pit that probably was allowed by God because he needed us to be able to see what was happening. Now, we know that Romans 28 tells us that all things work together for the good of those that love the Lord, that are called according to his purpose. I'm going to tell you right now, it may not have necessarily been that I needed to go through what I went through with my fighting with God, but I can say on this side that because I did have those fights with God, that I'm able to now learn and to help other people and to relate to them on that level. So my experiences, although probably could have been avoided, right? If I had a better understanding of who I was, have now allowed me to be able to reciprocate understanding to other people, and now positions me to be able to pour into them so they can see themselves from a different light, from a different perspective, from a different angle. And I feel like that's something that we have to believe in as believers, that we have that ability to do the same thing, right? Because your book, that idea, that project, that brand, whatever it is that you're building, that you're writing, that you're creating, isn't just for you. Listen, there are seasons for everything. There are times where I have seen people talk about a book that they wrote years ago, right? Seasons ago, 2017, for example. Because there was a woman that I had met in 2021 who gave me this story in particular about her. She had wrote a few books, and one of her very first books she did in like 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember her telling me like she wrote it because she felt led to write it, and it was about some of the things that she had gone through. And she was like, listen, I did it, X, Y, and Z, and it ain't really pushed, it ain't really moved, it didn't really soar, right, the way that she thought it would, because she's like, God, you said to write it, so I'm gonna believe that it's just gonna take off and soar, and it didn't, right? And it kind of was like, huh? But she left it alone. She was like, listen, I'm gonna just be obedient. That's what he said to do. I did it, and then let me just work on the next thing. And who would believe that a few years later, in 2021, that it would become one of her best-selling projects to date? Because there was a surge that had taken place for her book in 2020 that caused people to find out who she was in a different way, that then allowed them to actually go after that book because what she had written was able to relate to them in the season that they were in. Sometimes we think that what we're creating right now, what we're producing right now, is going to soar in the season that we're in, and it can. That is for sure. But there's times that God will prepare us to be able to have stuff together for a future season, right? She didn't know that book was going to blow up 5 years later, 4 years later, but she was obedient to do it. And because it was already there, she was able to reap the fruits of that labor at that time in the season of which it was called forth to prosper. We have to understand that a lot of the stuff that we're going through, a lot of the things that takes place is the very tool that God will use to bless you. That's why being obedient to what he's calling you to do, what he's asking you to do, is necessary. That's why when it comes to writing, write the vision, make it plain. When it comes to writing out the pieces and doing the work is necessary. That's why when it comes to not being afraid and not having doubt, but just believing by faith that if this is what he's called you to do, it's going to take place. You have to have a level of understanding of who God is, right? And listen, don't play, because a lot of us have this fractured identity because of the world, because of teachings, because of life, because of experiences, because of trauma, right? You name it, you got it, it's there. And because of that fracture, it makes it difficult sometimes for us to do the things that we're called to do. Not because the thing is hard, but because of whatever that thing is that we're supposed to do, for whatever reason, it just seems to be much harder than what it needs to be. So, how did I overcome? How did I move past this? How did I get to the other side of this? For one, I had to start, right? That's just being honest. I had to start. I had to let go and just start. Number two, I did baby steps. I didn't immediately go after the book. I tried. And as I tried to go after the book, I remember I would just keep crying throughout every chapter. And I was just getting discouraged because I was like, God, all it does is make me cry. And I didn't realize that the crying that I was doing, the writing, even in my attempts, although they seemed futile to me, they were releasing what I was carrying. They were releasing the baggage. They were releasing what was necessary to come off of me so he could make room to do some other stuff within me. And I didn't see that initially, but I understood something was happening because after I would cry, I would feel lighter. After I would cry, I would feel better. And the story didn't get much better initially on the pages. But I remember feeling better and being like, wow, okay, God, I see you. And it kind of just went from there. And I remember starting off with journaling. I would just journal daily. I would journal at night. I would journal in the morning. I would take time aside. Um, Especially at this time, I had a newborn. So I did kind of, the whole, I hung out with him when he was awake. And when he was asleep, I would write. Sometimes I would sleep when he sleeps because, when the baby sleeps, you sleep. And I remember there was a point where if he was up with me, because by this point he was like, 10 months or so old, he would be like running around in the living room and stuff like that with me. And I'm like, you know what? We're just going to do this together. So I would sit him on the couch with me and I would just begin writing. I would give him a toy and he would try to type with me sometimes. He would be in some of my videos. I remember some of my early podcast episodes. You would actually catch his voice in some of my episodes talking or babbling, right? And at that time, that particular podcast that I had made was about motherhood. So I'm like, listen, this is my life, y'all. You're going to catch a baby or two crying in the background. And I was okay with it. I was okay with it. Um, but it was that concept that I had to be okay with the situation that I was physically in. I had to be okay that things weren't perfect. I had to be okay that as I began to walk out this journey, that God was meeting me in the midst, right? When it came to writing out the stories and stuff like that in my journal, I didn't immediately turn those into a book. I actually ended up stating, to a coach of mine that, hey, I want to write a book. I've been writing out pieces and elements, but I feel like it's too much for me to do right now. Like I can't do it, but I still feel this urge to like get the story out there. And I remember her saying, hey, I know you want to write a book and I know that it feels like a really big project for you right now. So why not start off with a blog, right? This way, you're just writing a piece, a little excerpt. You're getting it to your audience and stuff like that. And then as you get more comfortable with it, then you can begin to bring it forth as the book that you desire, right? And that was like one of the most like golden pieces of advice that I could have received at that time because Holy Spirit was all up and through that blog to the point where I was able to get the blog, the site host for it. I had used WordPress and I think I had to like Blue hosting for it or whatever. And I think I got it all together and ready to launch in less than a month. Like I think I did it in a few weeks. And not only did I have it in a few weeks, but when I began to like type out the stories that I was going to write on the blog, you guys, they started to flow like water without tears. Without tears. And it wasn't the way that I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be from like this super like sad perspective of like, oh my goodness, and X, Y, and Z. And y'all, he like changed everything for me. It wasn't from a super sad perspective. It actually was from a realistic perspective of overcoming. And if there was sad elements, he also put in there the faith component. And I just got to see it just blow up so like supernaturally and organically. And I was just amazed at the flow that he gave me because I surrendered to him what I was working on. And then he met me in the journey. Sometimes we think things are too hard because we think that we have to do it by ourselves and that we're doing it alone. The truth is, I was never doing it by myself. It was never a solo project. It was always going to be a project where I needed to link up with God because He was going to give me the words that needed to be said at that time. So, here is your official tips because I know I said it, but I went into another story. So, your official tip number 1 is this: begin writing. Just write, whether it's in a journal, a book, your phone, computer, just begin writing. Number 2, allow yourself to feel the emotions that arises from your writing and identify the source of those emotions. Is the emotion because the event was sad? Is the emotion because there's some unforgiveness? Is the emotion because it's triggering? And then understand why is it triggering, right? Number 3, pray and release it to God, whatever it is that comes up for your emotions, as well as what you're writing. And then number 4, ask God to heal those areas inside of you. Writing is therapeutic. For some people, you may have to tie it with therapy as well. And for some people, there's just this healing that happens in the process. But seek God in that part, right? And the number 5, as you write, don't be afraid to allow God to reframe your narrative. Oftentimes, we get stuck wanting things to look a certain way. Be open and okay if he chooses to change the words up for you. Be open and okay if he chooses to shine a different light on it than what you could have imagined. Be okay with allowing the Holy Spirit to really just move through the project so you can begin seeing how he's able to not only bear witness unto other people, but even unto yourself, right? Because you're going to look at that project and be like, yo, I know that was nothing but God because there's no way I could have done it, right? And then number 6, don't get caught up on the editing part, right? Don't get caught up on the makeup of the words or if it's perfect or did you word it this way right or did you word it that way right? Don't get caught up there. Tip 7, just write it to completion. There's always room to go backwards and to edit once it's been completed, but write it to the level of completion where you know this work is done. And then number 8, give it a break, right? Take breaks while you're writing. And then once it's completed, give that writing piece a break. Don't try to go back to it immediately to do the edits on it or to find someone to edit it just yet. Give it a break to breathe, right? Let that go into a surrendering with God and really just allow what just transpired in your life to take place and to celebrate that you wrote your manuscript or that you wrote whatever it was that you were called to write. Maybe it's for a play, maybe it's for a movie, right? But take pause in that to celebrate that victory for that moment and to just appreciate the goodness of God and how he met you. And then 9, when you go back, ask God to give you his lens when you reread it and be open to the nudges or the suggestions that you feel in the spirit about how some things may have to be reworded. Now, for some people, maybe you're not called to be the one that does the rewriting. Maybe you're not the one who is called to do the editing of your own work. Maybe he has someone else in mind for you. Pray about them, right? Seek who you can actually have to read it over with you or for you. And allow God to lead you in that part there because he knows exactly who should or shouldn't read it, right? He knows what perspective he's bringing out of it. He knows what light and angle that is going to be shined from it. So trust the process with the work that you're creating and trust that you don't have to lean upon your own understanding and that he's going to direct your steps in this process. So that basically is your tip number 10. So I hope you have enjoyed this whole live this morning. I hope you had gotten some nuggets. I hope you were encouraged by my testimonies, by my own stories of really having to get past my own self and just watching the fruits of it take place. And I hope that you're encouraged for your own journey, that writing doesn't have to be hard. Now, we'll be coming back to you guys again with other tools and tips and probably some shorter videos because this one is a little longer than I expected. But needless to say, I hope that the words here definitely helped you out. Peace and blessings to each of you and have an amazing day. Ooh, and don't forget that we are also getting ready to launch an online course for writers just like yourself starting in February 2025.